was in a period when there had been an expansion of the nuclear industry. There had been a very lengthy inquiry into the Sellafield reprocessing plant, which in those days was Windscale, I think, at one point. And there had been a number of nuclear power stations taken forward, and this was the run, really, of the big push in nuclear power. So, for instance, a lot of the people involved in this action were involved in direct actions against the Torness nuclear power station in Scotland. In fact, the group that did this, we actually blockaded the gate of Torness nuclear power station building site, when it still was a building site, with another scaffolding tower. We were quite into scaffolding towers as a way of operating. It's the precursor to the tripod, I think. So it was a time of quite intense activity on anti-nuclear power campaigning, and as always in a big campaign there's all kinds of people involved in it, running from very conventional NGOs doing stuff to the direct action groups. But I'd say that there was actually a very strong direct action movement against nuclear power at that time, and it probably was in fact the main area that direct action was happening in, apart from, you know, stuff more like strikes and things, which obviously was going on quite intensively in that period. And there is, interestingly, in this campaign also some quite big trade union involvement, which was pretty crucial, in fact, in terms of what turned out in the end. So this action was part of a broad anti-nuclear power movement which was very active in the period. It was also part of a particular campaign against dumping nuclear waste at sea, because that's what this action was all about. It was trying to stop a ship being loaded with nuclear waste which was going to be dumped in the ocean. And that campaign embraced a whole string of different groups, and I'd say that probably Greenpeace of the conventional NGOs was the most active. It was doing stuff out at sea, literally getting in the way of the dumping operation, whereas it sort of rather fell to more local groups to do the stuff on land. Sharpness, in case anybody doesn't know, is about 20 miles north of Bristol, at the head of the Severn Estuary. There's a little port in the middle of nowhere, and you sort of think, why use a port like this for this sort of operation? But I guess because it was a little port in the middle of nowhere that nobody cared about, they used this to load up a ship once a year with all the intermediate radioactive waste from the UK, and that was both from civil nuclear power stations and from nuclear weapons manufacturing. It was both. And intermediate level waste is pretty dangerous stuff, particularly the stuff coming from the nuclear weapons plants contain plutonium. It was not low-level waste, as lots of the news reports gave, because low-level waste in most circumstances is that sort of waste that can literally be disposed of on a rubbish dump. But this waste needed containment or needed remote disposal is what was the current thinking at that time. So that's the context for what we were trying to do here. I've put up here a few newspaper cuttings and things from the time, and my friend here has just brought along a couple more, which is really nice. Just to say that the previous year, this action that we're going to see was done in 1980. In 1979, we actually, the same groupings, we went and occupied the cranes that were loading the ship, and managed to stop loading for a few hours out of a week's loading operation. And so there was already an expectation that there was going to be direct action down at the docks at Sharpness. So we thought we'd go and do it somewhere else, and that was quite a successful tactic. There's the text here of the leaflet that was put out at the time, and some of the newspaper coverage. I'll just point this out because it's actually quite an interesting document. This is actually just a bit photocopied out of a petition that Greenpeace organised, a petition of important people. But this particular list includes Moss Evans, General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, Jim Slater, General Secretary of the National Union of Seamen, Ray Buxton, Secretary of the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen. They had great names in those days, didn't they? And Lawrence Daly, Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers. And actually, those trade union connections, as we'll come on to later on, were actually pretty critical in terms of what happened with the overall campaign against sea dumping. That there was actually strong union support against what was going on. So, the film we're going to show you was originally done on Super 8 cine film. It then got transferred onto VHS. And finally it got transferred onto a DVD. So the quality is absolutely rubbish. But I think it still nonetheless gives quite an interesting impression of what happened on the action. It doesn't actually have a soundtrack other than a rumbly locomotive sitting in the background, so I'm going to talk over it as we go through it. And the film starts at 6 AM on a small bit of railway track that runs from the main railway near Gloucester down to Sharpness. So here we are, 6 AM in the morning. So this was groups from Bristol, Bath and Stroud. What we're actually doing here is erecting a rather flimsy little scaffolding tower, which is 20 feet tall, on the railway track. And this is also in the days before mobile telephones. So all our communications on that day was actually done through phone boxes, believe it or not. We were tracking where the train was, and people were standing on bridges all the way up the main railway line, saying, all right, it's just gone past, so that we knew roughly when it was going to arrive. So
was it the train going to the dock or from the dock?
It was going to the dock, and it went initially up to Gloucester to the marshalling yards. They then formed the train up. So we were all sitting there anxiously watching up the railway track. People have gone up the railway track with lots of signs basically saying the line is blocked to warn the train. And so here we are sort of standing around feeling very, very nervous, waiting for the train to arrive. It's a white wave facing. This is Kevin, who was for a part of the Bath anti-nuclear group, going up to a banner on our scaffolding town.
Did you choose a bit where they could see you from far away?
Yeah. No, where we parked on scaffolding tower was actually very, very carefully chosen, and it was pretty critical where we put it in terms of the length of the train. The train was 1/4 of a mile long, and it had well, you'll see it a bit, yeah. This is Rosie, who's part of the Stroud group. That was Ian, who sadly is one member of the group who no longer is with us. He died of cancer shortly after.
Did you know that there was a speed limit on that particular line? Was there a speed limit?
There wasn't a speed limit, but this is a single track railway line. They've just come over a junction, so they're travelling quite slowly. We knew all of this because we'd been observing it. So this was actually the second day of the loading, so we'd seen the train the previous day.
So you're train spotters, aren't you?
Yeah, and here comes the train. And you can hear, in fact, he's already got his brakes on. But it was, we weren't on the scaffolding tower as this train came up here. We were standing below it, and just climbing up as we knew we could see that it was going to stop. The train had police on it, had British Transport Police on it, because they were definitely expecting trouble. Now you can see that they stopped the train and then they moved it up. And the reason for that was the scaffolding tower is actually the right length to sandwich the train between the scaffolding tower and the points at the other end. So the train was literally blocked in at both ends.
So the police definitely knew about it?
the police knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know where it was going to happen. And we'd actually organised a diversion demonstration down at the docks. So they were occupied with that.
Can you just explain what you just said about the train being sandwiched in?
Well, this is on a little sideline. The main railway line is up the top there. So it actually come off the main line, come down here, met our blockade. At the other end was the points where it come off. So it was sandwiched between the points and us. They couldn't reverse it. No, they would have blocked the main railway line if they'd done that. So we had support people on the ground. As I say, the train was about a quarter of a mile long. It had 300 drums containing the radioactive waste. And these are just like oil drums lined with concrete with the waste in the middle of it. Not something that's going to last that long in the sea. So, they were expecting that these, basically the waste would leach out of it. So, having got up there, as always on an action, you sort of, that's all very exciting, and now we sit around for a few hours while the police try and sort themselves out.
Were you able to talk to the train driver at all?
We couldn't speak to the train driver. The train driver actually, I think, got out and left fairly soon. Yeah, I don't think he hung around really. Police were on site pretty quickly, but only in small numbers. Because the group had done previous actions, there was an expectation in the press as well that we were going to do something. And we had actually talked to various members of the press. We hadn't said what we were going to do, but they knew something was coming. And the guy on the right here with the beard, TV cameraman, he's a freelance TV cameraman with HTV, literally lived down the road. He was on site almost within a quarter of an hour of us occupying the railway line, and it meant that this went out on national TV almost immediately. It's really high-tech film, isn't it? It's really good. So it goes on a bit like this. So there were 5 of us up there. That's me listening to the news broadcast on the radio. The guy in the middle here is the reporter from the Evening Post who was very keen to cover the story. That's Betty and Sally, who are 2 of our group who were supporting us on the ground. And as time went on, more and more police arrived. And this little lot here, which we're cheering about, is actually the group who were down at the docks, coming up from the docks, having done their diversion, and successfully kept the police occupied while we did what we needed to do. And there was a lot of us sort of standing around scratching heads while trying to think how we're going to get this lot down. It's David Taylor, who's one of the people in the Green Party these days. The woman in the middle here is, I can't remember her name, it's terrible, was actually the person who hired the scaffolding for the occasion. Jo, that's right. And she ended up getting nicked with the rest of us because she hired the scaffolding. So this is right beside the A38 running from Bristol to Gloucester. A nice busy road and probably a bit more busy in those days. So we were very obvious to passers by. There was some level of interest because of that. We came equipped for the rain, and it did rain. Thankfully not for very long. This was sort of like a classic affinity group type action. There were 3 affinity groups working together. the action. We'd all done a lot of stuff together before. We knew each other very well. We'd been arrested together before. So actually, as a group, we actually, you know, there were various things in the reports about it all being terribly well organised. Well, it was very well organised, and we were a very effective group. So we had the police inspector come up and talk to us several times, trying to sort of say, well, you've had your fun, it's time to get down now. And that sort of went on for some time. Then they came up for another bit of negotiation, but as you can see, we've all linked arms, because now what they did was they basically tried to grab all of our gear, including all of our food, water, things like that. So it's a good example of have your food in your pockets and your water bottle on you, don't have it in a rucksack because they're going to take it off you. I was involved in a direct action just literally a month ago where the same thing happened to me and I lost all the food in it. But they had a go at trying to pull us off and just decided it was too dodgy and came down. So more and more police arrived. Remind you, this is in Gloucestershire. The Gloucestershire police force isn't actually very big. So I think we had quite a high proportion of it there by the end of the day. The evening before, we'd actually been down at Sharpness taking part in a debate with a scientist from the Atomic Energy Authority about the wisdom of chucking loads of radioactive waste in the sea. And he actually came down to the blockade and he was hopping mad. He was absolutely livid about what we'd done. It was really quite satisfying.
So he reckoned it was perfectly safe?
Yeah, he thought it was great, yeah. More chats from the inspector sort of saying, oh, right, it's time to get down there, you've done your stuff. We obviously were watching all of this, and other people are sort of signalling to us about what's going on, sort of wondering what they're playing at, but they were hatching a plan, as we shall see in a minute. And we got more and more senior police officers came down, and by the end we actually had the Deputy Chief Constable of Gloucestershire there, who was the guy with all the stuff on his hat, who I think was pretty irresponsible in terms of how he ended up dealing with us. There he is. And there's all the nuclear waste, and you can see there's a lot of it.
Where was it from?
So it is from every single nuclear power station in the country and from all the nuclear weapons sites in the country as well. So it was basically about 2,000 tonnes of it were dumped into the Atlantic Ocean every year from the early 1960s.
So how frequent were those trains to Sharpness?
Well, they were bringing in 2 of those every day over the 5 days that they were loading.
All over the country?
From all over the country.
But then that would be it for a year?
That was a year's worth of waste that was being delivered, yeah. So basically they took the stuff out to sea in a ship called the Gem to a deep sea trench and tipped it over the side. It's really high tech stuff. Greenpeace, what they did was they went out with the Rainbow Warrior and then one of their other ships and basically try to get in underneath the dumping platform. So what their great idea was, pull the tower over. Putting the hangouts for us to land on. We didn't think this was a really good idea, surprisingly. So here come the cops coming up to fix the ropes on, I think, to sort of restrain the tower as it went over. But like, this is a slot together tower.
They're going to pull the tower over with you lot on it?
Yeah, that's their plan. So it's a slot together tower with us lot on top of it. And we were thinking, this doesn't look too good. I don't think they do this these days actually. I think the health and safety is really taken off. Yeah, so we decided that we'll go on top of the train instead. So we jumped on top of the train. Ourselves nice and comfortable. And that's the tower going over. It's not a very good shot of it. There's a news report later on where you can actually see it going over and it still gives me a shivers actually. Now this is interesting. This cop comes along, all smiley, cheerful, the rest of it, having a chat, and then he's talking to the Deputy Chief Constable down there, and his comment was, "Throw them off." That's what he said. So, having been given permission to rough us up, basically, the cops did. They, when they were right up on top here, they weren't doing anything very obvious, but they were pretty rough. As always, they go for the smallest person first, so Rosie got grabbed first. It doesn't give you the impression of how high it is on top of an engine, but you're about, 16 feet off the ground, quite high enough to do yourself an injury. And like, here's Kevin, we're getting the ladder out for him. And what happens? Well, actually, they just chucked him off the top. All got handcuffed, pulled around. This is Ken from Stroud. He's a real stubborn bugger, basically. He just would not go. And here we go, we just threw him off the top. What? If I'm going to chicken down, this is me. I'll just not going to go in the So at this point, we were all arrested, bundled into the vans here, were taken to Dursley Police Station, where we were strip searched and then locked up. And as you will see in a minute, we also then ended up in court that day. They held a special court session for us. Nice one, Rosie. Slightly hear it version. His main comment was, his main objective of the day was no policeman get hurt. So this is a quick news report, which we'll maybe just quickly flip through. I'm afraid this was taken by filming a TV, so again, that's why the quality.
The train was brought to a halt shortly after dawn today by a 20-foot tower placed across the railway line at Berkeley, 15 miles south of Gloucester. It was all part of a meticulously planned operation, with protesters further down the line waving banners to warn the train driver of the obstruction ahead. And at the same time, a second demonstration was staged at Sharpness to divert police attention. The police themselves tried to persuade the protesters to come down, but they refused to move. The train was carrying around 300 tons of low-level radioactive material in sealed containers. The protesters, mainly from Bristol, Bath and Stroud, had clearly done their homework well. They even calculated the length of the train so that when it stopped, it just avoided blocking the main line a few yards away.
Well, we've been planning for quite a long time because we know this happens every year. And so people have been up and having a look at the railway line several times, down the docks and looking at things and measuring and preparing for it all. It's been going on for quite a while.
Would you say this is now a successful operation?
Oh yes, definitely. I think it's very successful. We've stopped the train and they're still on top at the moment.
But 4 hours after the protest began, the police took action. They tied ropes to the tower, threatening to pull it down onto a layer of straw bales on the tracks. The demonstrators decided not to wait. They jumped down onto the top of the engine and began to run back along the train. Seconds later, the tower was brought crashing down onto the railway track. The police then made their move as the protesters, 4 men and a girl, staged their final sit-in.
We might stop it there actually, I think.
The police had been expecting trouble.
So, what happened then was we were taken into court that day, and much to our total amazement, and we were totally not prepared for it, they remanded us in custody. So this was at the beginning of the week of loading at the docks, and they basically, the British Transport Police said, if you let this lot out, they'll go and disrupt it again, which might have been true. So they locked us up in Gloucester prison for a week. So we had the interesting experience of living a bit of prison life for a few days, which none of us were prepared for. It was a bit of a shock. Not only were the 5 people on top arrested, but 2 people who were supporting us on the ground, 2 women, and a 3rd person, Joe, who had hired the scaffolding, and all of us were remanded in custody. So that, was, I suppose, a bit of a lesson that you have to go prepared for them to take sometimes a bit rather over-the-top action against you. But partly as a result of that, there was actually huge media interest. I think it probably was just a dead news day, but literally, it was the main news item on all the TV news. It was on the front page of The Guardian, The Telegraph and The Times. There were 2-page spreads in The Sun and The Star and The Express. Some of it was totally, cranks, irresponsible, this, that and the other, but some of it was reasonable reporting. And we got a huge amount of interest actually while we were in prison, and we got letters of support and telegrams of support from all over the country, and indeed from all over Europe, which was quite extraordinary. We were initially charged under Malicious Damages Act, which is Malicious Damages Act of 1861, and we were charged with under Section 35 of that Act. And the reason I know all about this is I got charged under Section 35 of the Act last year as well, which was kind of nice because it was 30 years after the last time I got arrested for doing that. This time we were stopping a coal train, but same thing. This particular section of the Act, the maximum penalty is penal servitude for life, and used to be hanging. It's an old Victorian bit of legislation, and was in fact a consolidation of a whole string of different sorts of criminal damage type charges that could be brought, and this act was bringing together the law from a whole string of different areas, including things like smashing up farm machinery that goes back to the time of the Luddites. So it was in a grand tradition of getting in the way of things and trying to stop things happening. The charges, in fact, after we went back into court, we actually ended up pleading guilty because we did what we did, but we were actually on a lesser charge and we ended up getting fined. We were each fined 350 quid, which in 1980 was quite a lot of money actually. But we, again, got huge support from around the country. We had a whole string of different musicians who offered to do benefits for us. And in the end, Martin Carthy, folk singer, came along and did a benefit for us in the Bristol Students' Union. And we raised 2,000 quid just from that one benefit. And in fact, at the end of the day, we ended up with about, I think, nearly £2,000 profit on the action after we paid the fines, which then paid for the campaign to go on, which is good news. What then happened was, obviously we got out of prison, the campaign did continue, and one of the key things that I wanted to point out to you was the trade union side, because what happened subsequently was, first of all, the National Union of Railwaymen refused to operate the trains, and then the National Union of Seamen refused to provide crew for the ship. So that stopped it, which was great, and it really was that workers' action that actually stopped it rather than anything we were doing. And then in 1983, the London Dumping Convention, which is a UN convention that controls what can be chucked into the sea, basically passed a moratorium on all dumping of nuclear waste. And that came after a huge amount of international pressure, which was, I suppose, very much orchestrated by Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. I think they did a bloody good job of it. And there was an extraordinary event at that London Dumping Convention in 1983 where I can claim to be one of the few people who slept on a Pacific island in the Thames, because basically what they did was Greenpeace organised for a London rubbish barge to be transformed into a Pacific island, and this was to highlight the fact that nuclear waste dumping was also being carried out by Japan in the Mururoa area in the Pacific, and so it was pointing out that Pacific Islanders were also being affected by this. So there was a vote, and the whole thing stopped. And since 1983, no nuclear waste has been chucked into the sea. And so it was a successful campaign. Where is that stuff now? Well, it's stacking up at Sellafield. It's literally sitting in those drums in a big warehouse in Sellafield. And 2,000 tons worth of it every year coming from the nuclear weapons and nuclear power program, stacking up there. They've nowhere to put it. So the story goes on. Conscious of time, but one thing, I don't know, can we just show some photographs, if I'll give you a key? There's a thing saying German nuclear protest or something like that. I just want to read you out, this is a letter of solidarity letter we got from Germany. And it says, solidarity to women and men who blocked the train carrying nuclear waste and are held in custody now from the anti-nuclear group in Oldenburg, West Germany. Something similar to your action happened in Oldenburg in September 1979. Then about 120 nuclear activists occupied train tracks for 1 hour to call attention to the first drilling activities at Gorleben. Gorleben being the long-term storage facility that the Germans had made for radioactive waste. So the action was going to be non-violent. The railway company and the police were informed well beforehand. But after 50 minutes, the police attacked us to remove us by force and violently using chemical mace, police dogs and clubs. 30 people arrested for a few hours. Now 9 of us are being taken to court. Do you want to just roll it, because they're not particular pictures. At the first trial, the judgment was 1,000 Deutschmarks, about £250, penalty or 50 days in prison. The public prosecutor had demanded 9 months without probation. One of us is elected leader of the gang and has to face extra penalties. We appreciate your action as justified act of resistance against the threat of nuclear power. We strictly judge how the police treated you and are shocked about the fact that you've had to spend a whole week in prison. Now, it was great to get that letter.
Where's this?
That's Germany, yeah?
That was Germany.
No, that's Germany, is it?
That was Germany in 1979. This is Germany in 2010. A rather bigger waste train blockade. This is blocking a shipment of about 120 tonnes of high-level radioactive waste that have been reprocessed at Cap-la-Hague in France. It was German waste, but reprocessed in France. They were then bringing it back from Cap-la-Hague to Gorleben, which was mentioned in that letter. And what happened was there were protests all the way along the 900-mile journey that this waste train had to negotiate. And this is the biggest protest, where something like 3,000 German protesters occupied the railway line last November. And it was an amazing protest because, you know, they had an absolutely enormous police force there, and they actually hit problems because the local farmers blockaded the police encampment, which is in the middle of the countryside, and they ran out of food and water. And so they were literally having to negotiate to get supplies into the police camp that was policing this operation. But, you know, this went on for a couple of days, this blockade, and they were blockading both the road and the railway, taking the stuff to Gorleben. This is after they cleared the protesters from the site. Something like 800 of them were actually arrested, and this is where they were being processed together on the site.
Where were they taking the waste?
They were taking the waste to this long-term depository at a place called Gorleben in Saxony. But you can see there the size of the grouping. That's all the photographs. So I just got these off the web recently. One of the bits in the report that I loved most, though, was that in one of the news reports he said, at one point 2,000 sheep were released onto the roads where the waste was to be taken, and there was a comment from one of the activist groups saying, "We just thought they'd like to take part." But you know, it was an example of what is going on now, and it is an example of how international the whole nuclear power operation is. So Cap-la-Hague is really France's version of Sellafield, and you know, Gorleben is one of the few deep depositories or long-term depositories for radioactive waste that exists. There's another one in Finland where they're using a deep depository there. But, you know, it's still an incredibly contentious issue. We have nuclear waste travelling through Bristol every week. There are trains going through Bristol carrying radioactive waste from Hinkley Point, and we are now faced with the possibility of a third nuclear power station down at Hinkley Point.
Have you seen the documentary about the Finnish one?
About this?
No, the Finnish one.
The Finnish one, no, I
can't remember what it's called. Someone's made a documentary, like they got full access to it and everything, about the storing of it and the longevity of it, because they're planning for 100,000 years. Hmm? Yeah, that's it, yeah. It's really spooky.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, there were, I think, much stronger connections in those days, and you know, the trade union movement was a much stronger beast in those days as well. But I do know that there was one of the guys who was one of the campaigners at Greenpeace who was actually a member of the National Union of Seamen himself, or was an ex-seaman, and he was quite instrumental in getting the National Union of Seamen on board, or off board in this case, to actually stop what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting point about ASLEF and the NUS and the NUR is that they both had extremely right-wing leaders in the early 80s. So it must have been a rank and file branch push on the national conferences or whatever. Because Sid Wheel and McCluskey were very, very right-wing trade union leaders, and no way would they have put their names to that list had they not been instructed to by their members.
It's just that I just remember from that time of my life that, you know, what I know about how Anarchist said, there was a sort of thing over C&D that was kind of like, you know, led by members, but trade unionists and sort of very nice people, so trying to get, you know, trade union branches, consistently presenting resolutions and
Yeah.
get them to C&D and
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's really tough going these days, really, to get that sort of, you know, I think there grassroots stuff does happen, but to get union leaderships to actually do anything is really, really very hard.
Talking about actions, I've got this newspaper here, Stop Nuclear Power Network. You've got a map of Britain at the back, and the new nuclear bills, 8 they want to build. The first one they want to build is Hinkley, and EDF wants to build it. They've got 60% of Bristol's electricity, so it's worth boycotting them. But there has been a call out for a mass blockade of Hinkley on the 3rd of October. That by C&D, so we're hoping everybody's going to turn up now. So please keep it in mind. We've got, I'll stand by the door, and there's a talk next Wednesday as well at the Smiling Show if anybody wants to start mobilising against the new nuclear bills. This is a time because to try and stop them building the next generation, at least. It's got to be done now.
Yeah, given what's just happened in Japan as well, you know, I think it's going to make it a lot harder for them to persuade people that this is a safe technology.
Is anyone attempting to monitor the stuff that was dumped?
The stuff that's dumped into the sea, God only knows. It is a long way down, no doubt about that. But you know, the science of, you know, people who weren't captured by the actual governments who were doing it, you know, basically saying, you know, over a period of time, it was just going to disperse through the food chain and would be a real problem in that part of the Atlantic. But you know, to actually go out and monitoring it, you'd need really high-tech equipment, and you need a specialist ship to do it. You know, it's a long way out. I think probably of more concern these days is what they're doing with nuclear submarines, because those have been dumped at sea, or have been unintentionally scuffed and things like that, particularly Russian ones.
And am I right in saying that the 5 unfortunate Bangladeshis that just got their sat-nav right outside Sellafield weren't terrorists?
I don't know about this type of stuff.
Oh, it's in all the papers.
Is it? Right.
Quite convenient when they killed Bin Laden.
Yeah, so the day after
Yeah.
Bin Laden was announced as having been assassinated, 5 Bangladeshis outside Sellafield were arrested and driven all the way to Manchester, strip searched and held in custody. And now and their houses in London were raided.
Right.
And it would appear they were just tourists who took the wrong turning, or we're just looking at the map. The day after Bin Laden got off.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your preference for power sources? What's obviously not nuclear, but what's your thoughts on that?
Well, rather than say what my preferences are in power sources, like my preference in terms of power systems, in terms of our political power, is that we control the stuff ourselves and we do it in our own communities and make our own choices about what we use. And obviously, I think if you do end up doing that, then people will probably end up with very different sorts of power systems from what we've got now. So that's where I put the emphasis, because you know, I can understand why people get upset about a wacky great wind farm across their nearest mountain. You know, I can identify with that as well. But it doesn't mean to say the actual technology per se is bad. It's just been put together in a bad way, and it's not been done by people who want to use that. It's been done by a big power company who's just come along and said, "Oh, there's a good place to put it. We'll put it there." So that's where I put the emphasis in terms of how we do
and
things.
if it's locally sourced, you're not going to make irresponsible choices.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, the actual economic, social, whatever argument even in terms of energy, there is no, it just doesn't make sense. You know,
I wasn't implying that it did, I just wanted, people, because we had spent so much time worrying about getting poisoned, I'm just thinking about the next step as well.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, in terms of building campaigns now around the nuclear power issue, we seem to be in a very different sort of environment to the one we were in then. I mean, I remember that period as being one in which it was very cool for young people to join anti-nuclear.
Yes.
That's what we did. They joined CND and they joined your local, and there were local anti-nuclear groups everywhere, and they were full on with it. They all wanted to do direct action.
Yeah.
We all went for non-violent direct action training, and there was a whole sort of part of the culture of resistance that developed around it was the idea that that nuclear power was part of a nuclear state. And that sort of language was used all the time. You couldn't defend a nuclear power station without, armed policemen. We've sort of lost that bit.
We have a bit,
seems to have got a little bit less.
George Monbiot and Co haven't helped.
So it's more difficult now, perhaps, to build a political campaign around.
I don't think the arguments have changed at all. I think they're the same.
But the numbers aren't there.
Well, I think that there's a lot going on. I think that's the problem. I think there's a lot to fight, but whoever I talk to, most people are against it. But it is true, we need to mobilise really quickly. Especially against the new bill, we need to mobilise.
When you talk about Hinkley Point, I remember in that period, I remember taking part in 2 or 3 blockades of little small ones. There were always there. There was a day when Prince Charles came down to see it for some reason, and it was about sort of 40 people turned up. We blocked the road. The police went mad. They closed all the footpaths within 5 miles of it, so we couldn't get around the back. So we were going to break in and blow it up.
I think one thing is interesting is the contrast with Germany, because Germany that mass mobilisation against nuclear power seems to be very live, and why it's itself there and not so much here is probably an interesting question.
I think you're right. I think it's really not. That's not the prevailing attitude of most people, young or otherwise. Unfortunately, it needs to be. It needs to change. It needs to be more people doing. But it's not. It's not. I think.
Quite a sort of period of, kind of,
I think.
protests.
Yeah, I think hopefully it's swinging back a little bit, but of normal people, it's not very fashionable at all. Whereas,
I think Steve's right. I mean, the link that was very strong in the early 80s between CND as a movement against nuclear weapons and Green and Common and cruise missiles and the anti-nuclear movement was very, very strong then. And I think that link's been lost in a lot of the campaign. This isn't a criticism, but a lot of the campaigning against Hinkley Point C hasn't made reference to what we always used to make, which is the link with the plutonium and what goes on at Sellafield and the nuclear weapons industry. We've lost that, and we need to get that back together again. And Steve's dead right on that. Yeah. In terms of the trade unions, there's definitely, for those of us that are in CUC unions, there's definitely a job to be done, and it's going to be really, really difficult because for now, nauseatingly, for the last 15 years, the CUC's got a policy. It's called a balanced energy policy. And a balanced energy policy, whatever we think about coal, we may disagree on coal, whatever we think about coal, the balanced energy policy of the TUC, believe you me, is a Trojan horse to let the unions who have lots of members in nuclear power stations make sure that pro-nuclear is part of the nuclear balanced energy policy. And therefore, it's not just that the nuclear energy policy of the TUC is therefore in a false way kind of balanced, and therefore that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But there's no debate on it. So what you get within the CUC is myopia. You don't even get the possibility of a debate between those unions like mine, CW, that's against nuclear power, party with members in the industry that are in favour. So everything's closed down, and it's almost impossible to get any kind of a debate in the TUC or the trade union movement. And if we can break through that, and to be honest, it would only take kind of 1 or 2 unions to have the bottle to put a motion to a certain conference that there will be a debate, and at least then we can have a debate.
I'm sorry, we're actually going to have to stop because we're 2 minutes before the next.
Very specific question. Do you know which trade unions represent workers in the nuclear energy plants?
Do I know which ones are?
Yeah.
Could I suggest?
Talk about it after.
Yeah, can I suggest? Sorry, just to be fair to them.
The next. What's the next talk? Is it Forrester Dean next? I think. Next talk, I think, is on success.